Hey guys, good to see everyone here. And welcome to this second program in our class of 66 Tiger Talk series. And once again, I'm glad to see we got so many people coming in today and a lot of new faces from our first one. Tiger Talks is one of the ways that we came up with to stay in touch with and learn from each other. And now Zoom enables us to do it on a worldwide basis. Before we get into things, I have a couple of announcements to make before I turn this over to John Holman. The first is the Harvard-Princeton game is coming up next weekend, October 23rd. And we don't have anything as a Class 66 planned at this time. There didn't seem to be enough interest, but there will be an all-university orange and black pregame rally at Fine Plaza. And that'll run from 11:30 to 12:30 if any of you are going to the game. You do need to register for this event. And I think all the clubs will be open and a number of them are going to have some sort of function. The Yale game is coming up November 13th, and I think we'll try to put something together for that one. With good fall weather should still be around with climate change. And so if any of you are interested in planning to come to the game, just let me know. And next week, we are going to have a first meeting of all our regional chairs around the country and abroad, Zoom meeting, of course. And I see some of you are here today. And with our regional chairs, we've got a number of new incentives planned that they're going to beef up our community building efforts, and more to come on that in the next few weeks. Well, last month's speaker, John Hemingway, took us on an African odyssey, for those of you who weren't here, and it really was quite a trip. We learned a lot about the current state of ivory smuggling, among other things. Today, we're going to travel down another road, one just as exotic and timely and interesting. Thomas Roy Reid, affectionately and universally known as TR, is going to regale us with insights and anecdotes of his varied and distinguished career. And he's also going to tell us what he means by "we're number 37." So it's going to be a great talk. And I've taken enough time, so let me turn it over to John Holman, who's going to introduce TR. And he's going to give you some ground rules for today's show. And so here's Johnny.
Okay, I should be unmuted now. Just a few ground rules for the day. As you can already tell, everybody's muted, and please keep yourself muted. There will be one exception to that. I'll get to that in a moment. But as much as we love your dogs and your grandkids and all of that, we don't need to hear them during the talk. We are also recording this talk. That recording will be posted on the 66 site later if you want to forward it to anyone or want to watch it again. We're going to have a Q&A, as we always do. And we want your participation. This is really crucial. I don't want to make a big deal about it, but part of what we learn here is from questions. And so you can write your questions into the chat. Everybody has a chat function, and you can write them in there. If the question is too long or you just don't feel like writing it out, you can just write in there, "I have a question." And when we get to the Q&A, which I'll moderate, I'll call on you and say, Fred has a question. Fred, go away. Go ahead. Or even if you've written the question out, I might ask you to amplify on it. So that's the case where potentially we will unmute you. Other than that, you should be muted. We are setting up the talk so that you have a fixed view of TR during the talk and of any media that he's presenting. But after the talk is over, you can put yourself in speaker view or gallery view. I suspect most of you know how to do that if you want to see everybody, or you can just leave it with the speaker highlighted. We also have turned on captions. This is mostly for the benefit of anyone who has hearing difficulties, but anyone who wants captions at the bottom can do that. Somewhere on your screen, depending on your platform, it will say CC or captions or something like that. And you can click on it and they'll come on. Or if you already see words, if you see my words right now at the bottom of the screen, as I can see my words, it's already turned on. A quick reminder about our next talk, November 17th, Joel Primack, who is our valedictorian, world famous cosmologist, winner of the Locomotive Prize, and a guy who's done an enormous amount to connect science to the real world and to the political arena. So you should join us for that. So enough in the way of that. Let me just talk about TR a little bit. This could easily take an hour. If it took an hour, everybody would be angry at me with good reason. So it won't. TR, the thing that I love about TR, of course, is that he was one of the creators of Joseph Hosnot, the famous fake applicant to Princeton. Any of you who are classmates know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're not a classmate, he and three other guys made up an applicant and got him admitted and almost got themselves expelled as part of that. He was, of course, a longtime Washington Post columnist. He was the bureau chief in Tokyo and in London. He also reported for NPR, for PBS, for National Geographic. He created and produced documentary films for those same kinds of organizations. He wrote 10 books. He got a big award from the Emperor of Japan for helping improve Japan-American relations. In short, this is the man for all seasons. And instead of talking more about him, I'm going to let you tell him about it himself. TR, it's yours.
Mute. Yep. Hi, Tigers. I want to first thank the class officers for setting up this series of talks. I thought John Hemingway last month was fascinating. His films are beautiful. So I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of you guys. And I want to thank Rick and Steve and John and Charles for asking me to do this. Thank you very much. But you know what? I do have one big gripe with these guys. I'm kind of ticked off at them because, I thought I could just come on here, and gab for 40 minutes, tell some stories, tell some jokes. But no, these guys are serious. They want substance. They wanted a topic. Okay. So we talked about it and we hit on the topic. We're number 37. That's the official title of this talk. And if you think about it, it leaves a lot of questions. Who's we? Who's the we who's number 37? And number 37 at what? What is it we're so bad at? And why are we 37? Well, I tell you what, I am going to answer all those questions eventually. But first, I want to talk about something that's definitely not ranked 37th, and that's the Princeton Class of 1966. In fact, I've been arguing for years that we rank among the greatest classes in Princeton's history, maybe in the top 5 or 10 of all the 275 classes they've graduated. I think you can make this argument. I've been making it for years. When I was on the board of Princeton early in this century, and I was the only trustee living in Europe, so the university used to have me go talk to the Princeton Club in Paris or Haute de Boer or Berlin or Dublin like that. And I would go and tell these people what was up at Princeton. And then I'd say, man, let me just remind you about the great class of 1966. I mean, we are awesome. So we had all-American athletes. We had Rhodes Scholars. We had a guy who was Dean of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. We had the Dean of the Business School at Stanford. We have award-winning authors, and we got a Nobel Prize before our 40th reunion. Man, what an awesome class. I used to really lay it on thick. I didn't tell them that this was all one guy. I didn't mention that part, but Mike Spence is part of us. We can all be proud of what we and he have achieved. And anyway, it's not just Mike Spence. It's kind of amazing to me looking back at all the companies and law firms and schools and universities and charitable organizations and national associations that our class has run. It's amazing. And I particularly want to point out our class's contributions to Princeton. I mean, the buildings, dormitories, endowed chairs, scholarships, academic prizes. We've had 2 editors of the Princeton Alumni Weekly from our class, the Princeton Prize, the Grand Marshal of the P Rate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Chris Eisgruber told me that the class of 1966 has been an incredibly valuable resource for Princeton. And I had a whole long list of guys doing this, but no, the class officers, they said, no, you got to get to word number 37, cut it out. So I won't go through my list, but I do want to single out one guy, and that's our classmate, Bob Rawson, who was chairman of the Board of Trustees at Princeton. I think longer than anybody in the history of the university. And that was because everybody admired Bob's calm and sagacious counsel. The board, the faculty, the administration, the alumni, even the Daily Princetonian was pretty nice to Bob when he was chair. One day when I was on the board, I was in my office in London, and I got a call from Shirley Tillman, the president. And this is really strange. This never happened. I think she probably called Bob Rawson every day for advice, but Shirley never called me. And I pick up the phone. She says, "Tom, this is terrible. This is terrible. What am I going to do? How am I going to handle this?" And I said, Shirley, what's wrong? And she said, well, you know how we all depend on Bob for his wise leadership, and he's been chairman of the board for 8 years now, and that's it. He's term limited, under the bylaws. He's done, and we're going to have to find somebody else to see if they can do that job. And I said, gee, Shirley, I mean, maybe this is crazy. I don't know anything about bylaws. Maybe this is impossible. But do you think could we maybe even change the bylaws? And Shirley said to me, I'll put you down as a yes, because she had this all figured out already. We did change the bylaws, and Bob served as chairman for 13 years. And I was just so proud of his leadership. But I'm enormously proud of what all you guys have achieved in half a century in a whole range of endeavors. In contrast, this guy, I became an ink-stained reporter. It's certainly one of the least respected professions in the United States, maybe with good reason. But, I wanted to be a writer. And as soon as I got out of the Navy, in fact, even while I was in the Navy, I started freelancing. And, quickly learned the first golden rule of freelancing, which is it takes just as much work to write a $500 story as a $5,000 story. So write for the big guys. And in the early 70s, the big payers were the men's magazines, Sports Illustrated, Esquire, Playboy, Penthouse, like that. And I started writing for them. And I was using the same byline I had at the Daily Princetonian, by Thomas R. Reid. And this caused a problem. This caused a big problem. So one day was just opening in 1973, I was just opening this issue of Playboy proudly to read my article. And my father called me in a rage. So here's the thing. See, I'm Thomas R. Reid, but I'm really Thomas R. Reid III. My dad was also Thomas R. Reid, and he was a big cheese in the Michigan Republican Party. And I guess in the early 70s, it was not, kosher for a Michigan Republican to be in Playboy. So my dad called me up and said, stop putting Thomas R. Reid in that filthy magazine. Stop putting my name in there. You're ruining me. So I had to change my byline, and that's how I became TR Reid, because of that incident. And then eventually TR Reid went to work for the Washington Post. They sent me down to cover the US Congress, which was a great beat. I really enjoyed it. And I got the idea, well, I'm going to write one of these books, how a bill becomes a law in Congress. To do that, it's a good idea, and those books sell pretty well, but But to do that, you gotta find a bill that works, because if you take all the bills that are introduced in the first week or so of a new Congress, 95% of them aren't going to get to final passage. So I needed one that would go all the way. I was really struggling this, and guess what? The class of 1966 came to my rescue in the form of our classmate Lee Rawls, who then was the chief of staff for Senator Pete Domenici of New Mexico. And Lee said to me, we've got a bill. It's kind of an obscure bill, but I think maybe it's going to go all the way this year. And sure enough, this bill that Lee was in charge of for Domenici was introduced in the first week of the 95th Congress and passed into law 2 years later in the final week. So it worked perfectly for this book. And I bet, as you can imagine, this book of mine, How a Bill Becomes a Law, it's full of compliments for the great Lee Rawls. Let me just read you what I wrote about our classmate. Domenici's chief strategist was Lee Rawls, 34, a lanky blonde who still looked like the Princeton basketball star he once had been, et cetera, et cetera. I laid it on thick for Lee, but we did get that book out. Covering Congress for the Washington Post was pretty good because, I wasn't in the newsroom. I was far from the boss, and they couldn't boss me around. Well, in fact, it's only 3 miles from the Washington Post office to the U.S. Capitol. So I thought, gee, maybe it'd even be better if I could get a little further from the boss. And I kind of took this to extremes. I became a foreign correspondent and went to Tokyo covering East Asia for the Washington Post, which was great. Our family of 5 Americans moved to Tokyo. We tried to figure out this incredibly exotic, teeming, fancy city, but there was a problem. And that is, Japan was really hard to figure out. Japan is a modern Western democracy with a capitalist Western economy, all wrapped inside an ancient Asian culture. So it was kind of hard to figure out. And guess what? Once again, the class of 66 came to my rescue, this time in the form of our classmate Tony Zaloom and his wife Vivian. They were living in Tokyo. Tony was a partner at the biggest law firm in Japan. And Tony and Vivian kind of took Peggy and me under our wing and helped us figure out how to handle Japan. We were just really grateful to them. It was an interesting time to be in Japan. I had some great stories. One night I was over at Sori-Kante, that's Japan's White House in downtown Tokyo, for a state dinner with the President of the United States. And as you may remember, the President of the United States got sick and barfed in the lap of the Japanese Prime Minister next to him, sort of a diplomatic snafu, you might say. Another story that I gave a lot of time to, while I was in Tokyo, there were historic developments in the ancient Japanese sport of sumo wrestling. Sumo is about 1,000 years old, and while I was there, for the first time in 1,000 years, 2 foreigners reached the top rank grand champion in sumo. It's the first time this ever happened, and they were both Americans. And I knew both of these guys. One of them was a pretty good friend of mine. He was a basketball player from Hawaii named Chad Rowan, nice guy. And he became a sumo wrestler. They gave him the sumo name Akebono, which means the dawn. And I was writing about these guys like mad. And so PBS asked me to make a movie about sumo. And here we're going to show you a clip from this movie. What's going on here is, one of the mysteries of sumo wrestling is before the 2 wrestlers get in the ring and fight each other, they move in and out of the ring for about 5 minutes. They stomp and they glare and they menace and stomp some more. And I never knew what that drill was all about. So here in this movie, I'm trying to answer that question.
To find out, I went back to the dressing room to talk to the guy who was the Michael Jordan of sumo wrestling. the great grand champion Chiyo no Fuji.
気持ちをこのどんどんどんどんそのアップ一番最後の引き際までギャーっていうふうなこの感情を持っていく。
Okay, here's what you're doing in that 5 minutes, and you're thinking of your strategy. You're looking at him, trying to guess what he's going to do. You're thinking about your strategy, but mainly you're building Apu. Did you hear him say Apu? Your own spirit. You're getting your own drive, Apu. And if it's Apu, you're going to win. And if you didn't get it Apu in that 5 minutes, you're going to lose.
Chiyo told me that now as a coach, he teaches younger wrestlers that the key to winning sumo, and this is so Japanese, is kokoro, that's guts, or soul. For the first, 1,000 years or so of sumo history, everybody assumed you had to be Japanese to have that soul. But this giant here proved everybody wrong. I think he's the greatest story in sumo. He's known in Japan as Akebono, but his real name is Chad. He's Chad Roan, an American basketball player. He switched sports a few years ago. He started out in the pits of sumo like everybody else, and through sheer hard work, he made it to the summit. He's the first foreign grand champion in the history of the sport. We started negotiating months ago for an interview with Akebono, but frankly, dealing with the Japan Sumo Association is kind of like being sat on by a 600-pound grand champion.
This means, this is the classic Japanese, it's an X, it means no-go. Bots, and that's what he said. Right now, bots. Later, bots. No-go. That's their basic rule. He said if Akebono wants to come out here and talk to us, that's fine, but in there, X.
So in addition to sumo, I had a lot of other good stories. One story I covered a lot, interestingly, was parking. So, you know, Tokyo is a town of 30 million people. The Japanese own more cars per capita than we do. So where to put all those cars was a huge problem for the city of Tokyo. And one way they handled this was they just kept raising the price of a parking ticket. And finally, it got to Niju Mayen, $2,000 for parking in the heart of Tokyo past your meter. And I wrote that story, and to my great good fortune, somebody at NPR in Washington read that and said, gee, could you come on our air and talk about that $2,000 parking ticket, which I did. And then I did NPR's morning edition every week from various countries for about the next 13 years. That was a good deal for me. One other thing about Japan, our family of 5 Americans got terrific healthcare in Japan. We just really noticed that we didn't have to wait and the care was great. From Japan, I went on to London to become the London bureau of the Washington Post, which was great. And our family all moved there, but there was a problem. And that is Britain too, it's confusing. You know, Great Britain is 4 different countries, different languages. It looks American, but it's really much more European than American. I was confused. And to my rescue, of course, came the class of 1966, this time in the form of our classmate, Tom Banghauser. Banghauser was running a business in Bath, England, maybe an hour west of Tokyo on the train. And I think you all know Tom Banghauser is a pretty big individual. He's a big boy. But he had this little tiny mini Morris, and he used to come puttering over from Bath to London in his Mini, and we would hang out, and he would explain Britain to me. Among much else, he taught me about the sport of cricket. We went to a lot of cricket, and it turns out to be a great sport, by the way. One problem that Tom couldn't help me with was the Prime Minister, Tony Blair. Tony Blair was Prime Minister then, and if you're the Washington Post bureau chief, you're supposed to go interview the Prime Minister as part of the job. And frankly, I've never had a problem with this. Just about every country I've ever worked in, it was pretty easy for the Washington Post correspondent to get an interview with the Prime Minister. I think this is because they think maybe the president of the US is going to read it in our paper or something, but not Blair. No, I kept trying and trying to see Blair, and he said, He said, you know how many voters of mine read the Washington Post? 0. I don't have time for you. And this was troubling me. And then one day, my secretary, Teresa, came in my office with this look of astonishment on her face. And she said, blimey, it's the prime minister on the blower. He was on the phone. So I picked it up and Tony says, Tom, cheerio, how you doing? Like we were old buddies or something. And he says to me, hey, why don't you drop over to number 10 for a chat? Well, okay, I'll come. When should I come? He said, well, come at tea time, which is a problem because it's very different classes in Britain have different tea times. But anyway, I went, and here's what Blair said to me. At that time, he was the president of the European Union. The prime ministers of all the European Union countries rotate the presidency every 6 months. And Blair happened to have it right then. And he was having a summit meeting of all the EU leaders in Wales. And he wanted to get a bunch of reporters to come. And man, I said, oh God, what, I'm going to spend a weekend listening to a bunch of gas bag politicians. And Blair said, no, I don't think you get it. This history is being created here. We are replicating what your states did. We're going to create a United States of Europe, and it's going to be a big world power. So I did go to this. He talked me into it. I went to this meeting, got very interested in the EU, and became sort of the chief Washington Post correspondent on the EU. It worked great because right about that time was when the European countries gave up their marks and pesetas and liras and kroner and adopted the euro. So Americans were pretty interested. And sure enough, I wrote a book about this, the United States of Europe, which is the words that Tony Blair told me, but actually that's a Winston Churchill statement. One other thing I want to point out about London is I think the Washington Post must have been pleased with the class of '66 connection to their London bureau, because after me, they sent Griff Whitty, the son of our classmate Mike Whitty, to be the London bureau chief. One other thing, in London, both in Britain and in France, where we used to go skiing, my family got great health care, very good care, no waiting, and it was cheap in France and free in Britain. You don't get a doctor bill in Britain. Now, all this time, all through my career, I had been writing books, and let's be frank about it. All of my books, frankly, were flops. Nobody bought them. They were good books, I'm telling you, but nobody wanted to buy my books for years. One place that my books did sell was China, amazingly, although I didn't know it. And then in 2011, I was doing a story in Shanghai, and I went into a bookstore and I found this book. There it is, My Europe book in Chinese. And it's a very handsome edition, you know, I mean, it's nicely printed and bound and everything. They were selling it for about 20 bucks in Shanghai. And so I didn't know about this book. So when I went home, I said to my agent, hey, when do I get the royalties from my China editions? And she said, royalties? You don't get royalties. They just steal them. They take your books. They've taken about 6 of my books. They translate them into Chinese. They print them in these handsome volumes, sell them for 20 bucks, and the author doesn't get 5 cents. It really, can you tell I'm kind of ticked off about this? They're pirates. So I just want to say, if you ever find yourself reading some boring essay or something about China not respecting intellectual property, it's true, and they're shafting your classmate because of it. And then, interestingly, in the 21st century, I started getting some books that actually sold. There's some books that sold pretty well. And finally, I got a couple of bestsellers, which means finally we can get to the point of this lecture, which is word number 37, because this book down there on the bottom right explains that. As I told you, all the time we were overseas, we marveled at the healthcare we got in these other countries. My daughter, Willa Reid, always had, she had chronic otitis media, which means recurring earaches. And in America, you've probably done this too. We would take her to the pediatrician, doctor would give her a penicillin shot, we'd walk out and the earache would go away eventually. And in America, in those days, this cost maybe 120 bucks. Probably today it's 200, 225 to go to a pediatrician. And then, as I said, we moved to Japan. Of course, about a month later, Willa got an earache and we went to the pediatrician in Japan. She gave Willa a penicillin shot. The earache's going to go away, but the very good care, very similar to going to the doctor in America, except for one thing. The bill was 1,480 yen, 14 bucks. 14 bucks for a treatment that was just as good as we got in America for $120. Then we moved to Britain. Willa got an earache. We went in and we called the doctor. Get this, in Britain, the doctor came to our house. She examines Willa. She says to me, I believe a penicillin jab is indicated. Yeah, give her the shot, give her the shot. And Willa would get the shot. We know she's going to get better. And then guess what happens? The doctor walks out the door. There's no bill. There's no copay. There's no deductible. There's no insurance premium because Britain is providing health care through the government. Nobody gets, most people, very rarely get a doctor bill there. And so I'm thinking about all this and I'm thinking, gee, there may be a book here. There may be a book in this. And then I discovered the World Health Organization report. This is a famous or notorious, if you're American, report. The World Health Organization in Geneva hired a professor at Harvard to study all of the 200 different national healthcare systems in the world and rank them from 1 through 200. And I bet you've already guessed where the US was ranked in this ranking of healthcare systems, number 37. We were ranked 37th in the world, at the bottom of all the rich democracies. And I thought, boy, I'm going to write a book on this. How come we're so bad? And how come the other countries like us, I mean, advanced, high-tech, free market democracies, can do so much better? And yet they spend, a half or a third as much as we do. So I wrote a book about it. And once again, I really benefited from the help of our class. Roller, Bill Leahy, 66, neurosurgeon, over and over explained to me what it's like to be a doctor, the economics, the emotional business of treating people and helping people get well. And then I went to Princeton to work with the greatest healthcare economist, Uwe Reinhardt, who really helped me. And that's when 66 came right in to help. While I was in Princeton, I lived in Lanny and Sarah Jones' house. Lanny was teaching at Northwestern that semester, so I lived in their house. And Lanny, Brian Buell, Bert Kerstetter, Charles Sloan, the whole 66 borough of Princeton community really were there to help me and taught me through that book, which helped a lot. And then while I was writing this book, I mentioned to the producers at PBS Frontline that I was going to the doctor around the world, and they loved it. They said, oh, yeah, we can make a film on that. So we did make a film. I think it has a terrible name. Its name is Sick Around the World. But here, I'll show you just the very beginning of that PBS Frontline film so you can see what it was doing.
That's the capital of the richest, most powerful nation in history. But when it comes to providing health care for people, that great country, our country, is a fourth-rate power. The World Health Organization says the U.S. healthcare system rates 37th in the world in terms of quality and fairness. All the other rich countries do better than we do, and yet they spend a heck of a lot less. How do they do it? That's what this film is about. We're going to go around the world to see what lessons we can learn to fix America's sick healthcare system. I've covered the world as a foreign correspondent, and right now I'm writing a book about healthcare systems overseas. First stop on my tour is Great Britain.
where our family lived for 5 years.
So that film did quite well for PBS. They liked it, and I made a few other films about healthcare for PBS. In one case, a producer from PBS called me up and said, "Hey, we're making a film, a documentary about medicine in India, this ancient Indian medical practice called Ayurveda, and we think you should be the host." And I said, "Oh yeah, of course. You want me to be the host because I'm such a dashing presence on screen, because you know I'm a distinguished, experienced foreign correspondent who can figure out these complicated foreign matters." And this guy said, "No, no, no, it's none of that. We heard you have a bum shoulder," which is true. But this shoulder I broke in the U.S. Navy, and I can't get it much higher than this. He said, "Ayurveda thinks it's good on shoulders, so we thought maybe you should be the guy." So guess what? I did. I went to southern India for 6 weeks to the Mayo Clinic of Ayurvedic medicine. And it was a little strange. I mean, they wouldn't let me shave or comb my hair the whole time I was there because they said that would get in the way of the treatment. Figure that out. But in fact, it was great because the fundamental means of treatment in Ayurvedic medicine is massage. And I don't mean just one woman in a leotard rubbing some muscles. I mean, they do it right. They anoint you with herbal concoctions. They pour warm oil all over your body, and then 6 guys massage you for 45 minutes or so. It was great. Here, we'll take a look at a clip from that film.
Maybe this massage will evoke a healing response. But even if it doesn't, I'm not complaining.
You know, I always tell my kids what a tough job it is to be a foreign correspondent, but they never believe me. Vinod was moving my arm further to see where it would go, and he's twisting it in different directions. So that's starting to be familiar. Of course, the difference is, unlike an American physical therapist, here in Ayurveda, when the guy is stretching your arm, his partner is pouring very hot oil down into your armpit, which sounds disgusting, but actually it feels great.
It's all part of the Ayurvedic theory that environment is a major factor in illness. Make the environment better, and you make the patient better.
So what we modify is the external environmental conditions.
So there I was, in other words, going around the world trying to figure out what's wrong with U.S. healthcare and how can we fix it, which leads to the last question: why do we rank 37th? We shouldn't. We have the best medical schools in the world, best trained doctors, fabulous hospital facilities for most people. We lead the world in medical research all over the world right now. People are walking around who would be dead except for some American medical innovation. So how then can we rate so low? And well, in one area, we rate first, and that's spending. We spend about $3.6 trillion per year on healthcare in our country. And yet we get less than the other countries. All the other advanced democracies have longer life expectancy, lower neonatal mortality, generally, not always, but generally better recovery rates from disease or injury. They're doing better than we are, and yet spending that much less. We're spending about 19% of GDP on healthcare now, about $1 out of every $5 we spend. Switzerland is next. You know, they have this Cadillac healthcare system. They're spending about 14% of GDP on healthcare. Most rich democracies are spending 11, 12%. We're spending 19% with worse results. We're just not doing as well as the other countries. How can that be? Well, the answer lies in what's known as the original sin of America's healthcare system, and that is all the people that are left out. We have fabulous doctors, fabulous hospitals, but we also have large numbers of Americans who can't get to them in our country. At the moment, according to the Congressional Budget Office, in June of this year, about 30.7 million Americans had no health insurance. Another 50 to 60 million are what's called underinsured. That's a term that means you have insurance, you pay the premium every month, but the copay or the deductible is so high you can't afford to go to the doctor. And what happens is these people who are uninsured just can't go to the doctor when they first feel an ailment. And guess what? About 3 months later, this illness becomes much worse and they end up in the emergency room getting emergency surgery at enormous cost, which is one of the reasons we spend so much more, because we're doing so much more of it in the emergency room. American hospitals have the world's finest NICUs, that is the neonatal intensive care unit. We're great at this, and the reason is because we have to. About 100 times a week, there's some dispute on this statistic, maybe more, about 100 times a week in America, a woman walks into the emergency room 9 months pregnant, ready to give birth, and she's never seen a doctor. And those are the $1 million kids that we try to keep alive in these NICUs. If we spent the same money on prenatal care for every woman in America, we'd have healthier kids and spend a lot less. But because the United States, excuse me, has never committed to universal coverage, we lag behind. And in my book, I argued, doggone it, time has come. Let's see to it that all our neighbors have health care if they're sick or injured. I mean, think about it. If some kid down the street from you is too sick to go to school, wouldn't you like to get her to the doctor so she can get an education and build a better life? So how can we do this? So when I went around the world, what I found was there are various different models for providing universal health care. One model, the one we saw in Britain, providing health care is government's job. The government owns the hospitals, the surgeons, the nurses, the lab technicians, the what they call physios, the physical therapists. They're government employees, and you go to this government facility and there's no bill. It's all, or the doctor comes to your house, as I said, and there's no bill. It's not free. Healthcare is never free. And they pay for it. They pay for it through taxes. The sales tax on anything you buy in Britain is 20%. But in my book, I worked it out as significantly cheaper than what most Americans pay for health insurance. And Britain covers everybody. So that's one way, is what you might call socialized medicine, the British way. And it works. And therefore, it's used in a lot of countries: Spain, Italy, all of Scandinavia, Cuba is an example of this, New Zealand. But that's not, but I just don't, I want to emphasize that big government socialized medicine is not the only way to get this done, because if we go across, the channel to the mainland of Europe, we see the mirror image of the British system. In Germany, there's no government insurance plan. There are no government doctors. Everybody is on private insurance. The hospitals, the doctors, the labs, the drug companies, the chiropractors, they're all private. And the private insurers pay them. Germany doesn't even have Medicare. People stay on the private system, cradle to grave. And then a third method is kind of a combination of these two. It's government payment of private doctors and private hospitals. That's a system that was invented in Canada in the 1940s by a guy named Tommy Douglas, who's a big hero in my book. I really like him. And he created the system where everybody pays into a government insurance plan, and then the government plan pays the doctor and the hospital. And Tommy Douglas even came up with a good name for this. in 1944. You know what it was? He called this system Medicare. And sure enough, in 1965, when Lyndon Johnson finally gave health care to all our seniors, he took the model, that is public payment of private providers, and the name Medicare from Canada. Today, there are about 69 million Americans on that system. And Medicare is successful. It has the highest satisfaction rates of any insurance plan in the United States. And then finally, most countries in the world, the poor countries of the world, don't have any of those free models. Their model is what's called the out-of-pocket model, which is what it means. If you have some money to pay the doctor, you can get care for your child. If you have no money, she stays sick or she dies. That's the way of the world in most poor countries. And as I said, I wrote a book about this. I went around the world to do the book at great expense for Penguin Books. Then I went back around the world for PBS, which was fun. That was a great trip. It was funded by viewers like you, so I thank you. And what the secret is, which I hope you don't tell the accountants at PBS, is I could have seen all those models and never left home, because we've got them all. We've got them all. If you're a veteran like me, or like many of our classmates, or in TRICARE, in the military, well, you live in Britain for healthcare purposes. You go to a government hospital, you get free treatment, and there are no bills. If you're sharing private insurance with an employer, cost of private insurance with an employer, you live in Germany. That's the German model. About 140 million Americans are on that model. If you're using a government insurance plan like Medicare, well, you live in Canada. And for those 30.5 million Americans with no insurance, they live in Armenia. They live in Angola, Afghanistan, as far as health care is concerned. If they're really sick, they can go to the emergency room. Maybe there's a free clinic, but quite a bit of the time, uninsured Americans just don't go to the doctor. And that's, as I said, why our costs build up. So the first thing we need to do to fix this is commit to provide health care to everybody. And any of those models would work. It may be that we'll eventually get to health insurance, private health insurance for everybody. Massachusetts is now at 98%. It may be that we'll have a government plan paying private providers. That's what Medicare is. I'm not exactly sure which one we'll end up with, but I think because Americans always do the right thing, we will get there. So if you ever have a chance to talk to anybody in Congress or in your state legislature, say to them, how is it that the world's richest, freest, most powerful, most innovative country still can't provide health care for everybody? My argument to you is we could, we should, let's get it done. And then we'll no longer rank, we'll no longer be able to say we're number 37. Thank you.
Okay, TR, I'm back. Can you hear me?
I'm here. I hear you. Yes.
So we have a bunch of questions, and I think we'll get others. I have to start with one from Bill Bethune, just a short question, where he says, how do we know this is the real TR? to which my response is, after seeing the Ayurvedic massage video, we know it's the real TR.
Yeah, yeah. After I made, hi Thune, after I made that film, you know, PBS Films, they first show them nationally, and then they give them to the local affiliates. They can show them anytime they want. And, you know, my films, they show about 2 or 3 in the morning when they're trying to fill blank space on the air. But still, some people see them, and people come up to me in the grocery store and say, hey, weren't you in that movie in India? Yeah, that was me. And they say one of 2 things. They either say, how's your shoulder? Or I saw you naked.
Bill, if you can unmute yourself, if you're not already unmuted, why don't you ask your second question that you wrote in? Or I'll read it if you, there you go, good.
TR, how did Colorado fare with its version of universal coverage? Weren't you behind some bill for that in Colorado?
I was, yes. So in 2016, a bunch of people in Boulder, Colorado, we call it the People's Republic of Boulder. This is who I thought were kind of hopeless, idealistic lefties, came to me and said, we have a plan for a government-run health insurance plan that would cover everybody in Colorado, improve our health, and cut our costs dramatically. Can you help us? And I said, oh God, come on, a bunch of lefties. It took 96,000 signatures to get on the ballot in Colorado. These people had no organization and no money. And I said, well, good luck. Anyway, they came back to me 3 months later and said, okay, we got 154,000 signatures. We got on the ballot because when they explained what we were trying to do, people liked it. It was better than the insurance they had. So we ran this statewide campaign. I was the chairman, and we lost horribly. I think the main reason was crap chairman. That's the main reason. But mainly the insurance companies did not want any state to experiment with this. The insurance companies, Big Pharma, and the Hospital Corporation of America poured in $8 million against us. They made very funny TV ads trashing us. And we lost badly, but I think when we get it back on the ballot in Colorado, we're going to do much better next time. That's what I think.
TR, Rick Bowers asks, how does our healthcare for the elderly rank in the world, especially given that we're now, dangerously approaching that category, if not already in it?
Yeah, actually, we do pretty well, reasonably well, once people get on Medicare. It's interesting. Theoretically, your health care should cost more the older you get. That's true for most people. But as a matter of fact, Medicare spends more on people from 65 to 67 than it does on people in the next 4 or 5 year cohort, because people keep putting off serious medical work until they get on Medicare, and so we spend more. There's a common statistic, a healthy life expectancy at age 60. When you hit 60, how long can you expect to live without serious health problems? And on that measure, the United States ranks about in the middle of the rich countries. Japan is best at that. Because once we get people on Medicare, we do pretty well. They go to the doctor and they get pretty decent treatment.
So I'm going to combine two questions. One from Dave Lee, maybe I'm going to combine three questions. One from Dave Lee is, what forces are resisting change related to healthcare? John Lamb wonders specifically if the insurance companies are to blame. David Marshak quotes from a book that says that race is a considerable factor in not providing universal health care. I realize those aren't exactly the same question, but they somehow lump together in my mind.
Yeah, well, as the great Uwe Reinhardt told me, and all economists agree on this, one noticeable factor about the US healthcare system is it's resistant to change. It's hard to change it. And the reason for that is there's some really big winners in the current system. The private insurance industry, the for-profit hospital industry, big pharma, specialist doctors, they're doing beautifully. And they don't want change. They fight change. That's why they poured so much money into Colorado when we tried to adopt a plan. So I'm thinking maybe we could design a national system like Medicare, where the government insurance provides a basic floor of insurance for everybody. This is what happens in other countries. And then the private insurers can come in and they can sell, supplemental. If you want hair replacement or breast enlargement or cosmetic surgery, let your Medigap or supplemental plan cover that. I keep thinking maybe we could buy off the opposition of the insurers if we offer them that deal, but so far they've very vigorously and successfully resisted any effort to change away from our current private insurance system. And in answer to the question, yeah, I think the insurers are largely responsible for our problem because they're so wasteful. They have the highest administrative costs of any insurance plans in the world. They spend about 20% on premium dollars on paperwork and salaries and advertising, stuff like that, not on healthcare. You go around the world and other insurance plans in Germany, they're not allowed to spend more than 5.5% on administrative care, same in Switzerland. So yeah, I think our insurance companies have not helped us, but they're doing so great that they fight against any significant change.
What about the role that lawyers play in all this? This is from Dan French, wondering whether lawyers are part of the problem of frivolous lawsuits and things like that.
Yeah, this is what doctors say to me every time I address a medical group, if only it weren't for the malpractice. And they're right. The American malpractice system is a terrible way to deal with the problem. Every country has to deal with the problem of patients who are hurt or injured in the doctor's office or the hospital or don't get the care they should have gotten. Nobody else does it through the private tort system like we do because it's expensive. It steers a lot of the money to lawyers and experts rather than to the victims. So we ought to change our malpractice system, look at ways other countries do it, but it's not a huge cost factor. Most estimates say malpractice adds 1.5 to 2% to our costs. Well, 2% of $3.6 trillion, a lot of money, but it's not a huge factor.
If we can unmute John Slaybaugh and get him on the camera here, John, I'm going to let you ask your question. There he is.
Hi.
You're muted, John.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so first of all, great talk. Thank you very much. And I'm ashamed to be part of 37, but I'm not ashamed to be part of 66. At any rate, so you described 3 or 4 different, fundamentally different approaches to healthcare insurance. Is there a preference for any of those in the current infrastructure, the $3 trillion infrastructure proposal being discussed by the Democrats, or by, and you probably can't say a single Democrat, but back and forth among them?
Yeah. Well, so President Biden's talking about 2 things. One is he wants to expand the subsidies in the Obamacare system that would help more people buy private insurance. And that would help. Obamacare has provided insurance to about 22 million Americans who didn't have it before. But it's a very expensive way to go. Private insurance is an expensive way to provide health care for everybody. Biden has also
kind of more of the same.
What?
That's kind of more of the same.
More of the same, yeah. And it's I always say it's more incremental change, and incremental change is what got us in the mess we're in now. I think we've got to take the big step and say one way or another we're going to cover everybody. Another thing Biden wants to do is lower the age of Medicare from 65 to 60. I think that would work. I think that's a good plan. I think even the insurance companies might let him get away with that. And then maybe 5 years later, you lower it to 55, 50, 45, and eventually that way we could get to universal coverage. Either of those methods would work. I thought when I wrote the book, what America's going to do is we're going to do the German system. It's capitalist, it's private, we're going to have everybody covered by private insurance. And now, what is it, 10, 12 years later, I don't think that'll work. And here's why. The German and Swiss and in the Netherlands, other countries with that system, they closely regulate their insurers. Their insurers have to be nonprofit. They're charities. They're not companies. They have to pay every claim. They can't send you a letter denying a claim like our companies do. They have to cover every doctor, every hospital, every chiropractor, every spa. They can't have narrow networks, and they require fast payment. Our insurance companies sit on your bill for 30, 60, 90 days to get the float. In Germany, they're required to pay both you and the doctor within 3 days of the treatment. Nobody in America has that deal. In France, where they pay electronically, into the bank, they have to pay on the same day as your treatment. Our insurance companies would fight that tooth and nail. So I think probably some kind of government system, Medicare for all, or you could call it AmeriCare or Yankee Care or something, is the way we're going to end up, because I don't think we can make private insurance for everybody work in our country.
TR, we have some questions that are about other portions of your talk, and I want to make sure we get to that.
Fine.
So John Hart, do you want to come on and talk about the EU and your question? But unmute yourself first.
Doing it? Okay.
There you go.
Hi.
Yeah, I guess you could say you were at the creation of the EU, or the US of Europe. And could you reflect on the state of the EU now that we've had Brexit, and toss in the general US-EU relations?
Yeah, thank you, John. I wrote a book. I gave it the title from Churchill, The United States of Europe. And then the editor, not me, my editor at Random House put on the subtitle, The New Superpower and the End of American Supremacy. And that had some virtue. That book became a New York Times bestseller, I'm pleased to say. But I must say, every time anybody sees that book now, they say, really? You think it's a new superpower? No, it hasn't become a superpower. But I argue in that book that the real reason, the main reason for the European Union was to end wars on the European continent between Germany and everybody else, or between France and Germany, between Italy and everybody else. And it's done that. There hasn't been another World War II, another war on the European continent. Now in 45 years, Macron said, President of France said, his generation he's 50, he said his generation of Frenchmen is the first generation in 400 years not to have to go to war. So I'd say the EU did work for that purpose. And the euro, I think, is a successful currency. It has more daily users than the US dollar. But a new superpower, no, I just want to point out, I didn't write that. My editor wrote that.
I like the part about preventing wars, European wars, which,
yeah, it worked.
Yeah,
Think
how much time in history courses we spent learning about those wars. Do you think it can keep doing that? Do you see any threat to that?
Threat of war?
No, well,
they're beyond military. They think spending money on soldiers and guns is a waste. So
Okay.
they're just not equipped to have a war. Yeah, they're depending on the US. I think we still have 27,000 US soldiers based in Europe. They're depending on us to keep them safe, but they don't have the inclination or the equipment to wage a serious war anymore.
Great. Thanks.
Dave Lee, do you want to ask your Japan question? Because I think it's related. If you're still hiding there somewhere, there he is. You're muted, Dave.
Okay, can you hear me now, TR?
Yeah.
Going back to your talk on Japan, it's a fascinating country, and when you think about it, I wonder, do you believe that Japan, with its population density, is kind of a future model for the future of humanity? And what are the keys that enable Japan to function with 125 million people in a land area the size of California?
Yeah, those are really excellent questions. I don't think every country is going to get as crowded as Japan. It's not sustainable. I don't think it can happen. And all the rich countries currently, including the US, Japan, and Western Europe, have declining birth rates. Japan's population was 130 million when I was there 30 years ago, and now 127 million. I think I always, excuse me, I always thought Japan was a marvelous story because, you know, it's a small island nation, as you said, with no resources, no coal, no steel, no iron ore, no uranium, no oil. And they don't have enough room to grow food. They grow 5% of the calories they eat. And yet they built themselves into the third richest country in the world. And they did that, I think, through innovation, through very, very strong emphasis on education, particularly technical education, and through hard work. They just like working their brains out. They work hard because they live in fear. We sent two of our kids to Japanese elementary schools when we were living there. And one day, Kate Reid came home from fourth grade, I think it was, at the dinner table, just terrified, just feeling awful. And she told us at the dinner table, "Oh my God, Miss Watanabe told us the most awful thing today." She said, "Japan is a small island nation with no natural resources. And all we have here is ourselves, and we have to work hard. And if we don't all work our brains out, Japan's going to sink into the ocean." That's what they teach them in fourth grade. And then they do. They work hard, they obey the laws, they like rules, and they built this incredibly successful society. I noticed the current New York Times reporter in Japan, excuse me, Motoko Rich, is very down on Japan. Well, declining population, big debts, you know, their stock market is stagnant, etc. That's a way to look at Japan. It is the oldest country in the world, and people are retired and not working anymore and are a drain. On the other hand, they've been so successful, and it's such an orderly, law-abiding, safe country. I still have enormous admiration for Japan.
Thank you.
Rick, do you want to ask your question about healthcare pricing, Rick Bowers?
Oh, yes. So I had can you hear me? Everyone can. So I just had a couple knee replacements. And the last one, I got to look at the bill from Stanford Medical. It was over 185,000. That was the billing. Medicare knocked that down to about 23,000. This is an absurd pricing system. What can be done about that?
It's totally absurd. I mean, who came up with this? And if you complain to a hospital about the $180,000 bill, they say, "Oh well, nobody really pays that. You know, that's just our list price, but nobody pays it." But in fact, some people, particularly people without insurance, do get shafted and have to pay the high bills. In other countries, there's a price for medical care, and this is true in Britain, in Germany, even though it's all private. The health ministry basically sets the prices. Japan, the health ministry sets the prices. There's a price for each procedure, and that's what you're going to be charged, and that's what you have to pay, or your insurance company has to pay. In France, as a matter of fact, when you go to the doctor in France, she has on the wall the list of the 100 most common procedures in her practice and what the price is, how much you're going to pay, and how much of that insurance is going to pay for you. No doctor in America could do that because we don't have a fixed system of prices. I think we should. The state of Maryland now does for most hospital practices, and the hospitals initially said, "Oh my God, we're all going to have to close down." They've made it work fine. Medicare, as you say, has set prices, and the doctors and hospitals all bitch about it. It's not high enough, but they've made it work. So I'll tell you a story. I was on the board of the University of Colorado Medical School when the Army gave us an old Army base to build a new campus, and we were building all these new buildings out at our new campus while I was on the board, which is kind of fun because every month or so they would open a new building and we'd have, they'd cut the ribbon and sip wine and cheese and get around. This was happening all the time. And one day I was invited to one of these openings and I went out there. It was a 6-story building. We were opening a 6-story building, and the dean, who was Dick Krugman of the class of 63, by the way, the dean cut the ribbon and we sipped wine. And I said to the dean, "What are we going to treat in this 6-story building?" He said, "Oh, we're not treating anything there. That's the billing office. That's where 175 people work to do the billing in a university hospital in America. In Canada, the billing office would be 2 people. In Britain, 2 or 3. So until we can get some logic and rational structure for our pricing structure, we're going to continue to be shafted."
In the relatively short time we have left, I want to pivot to your journalistic career. And we have a couple of questions there. Gib Henschke has one. Gib, if you want to come on.
Yeah.
Actually, no, Carl, TR.
Yeah. Hi.
Yeah, quick
There's
question.
Gib. There's Gib.
You rescued me from my experience in Japan. Took me out to a very far away restaurant, and I always knew you at Princeton as a very modest person, but at this restaurant, people came up and asked for your autograph, and I noticed that you were on the Japanese equivalent of the Today Show, and then one young woman came up in that remote Japanese restaurant and asked for your autograph. Of course, it was de rigueur. And then she asked for my autograph. And I said, "Why?" And she said, "You are sitting next to Rido-san, so you must be famous too." That was the only autograph I ever gave, either on a napkin or some other part of her clothing. And how did you make the transition from being an All-American to Japanese?
Well, I told that woman that this is the head of the Biotech Medical Association, and she said, "Oh, I got to get his autograph." That's what she said. Yeah, I became a big cheese in Japan for several reasons. For one thing, I had better Japanese than most of the other correspondents from newspapers they knew, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and therefore I did a lot of TV. I did the Meet the Press in Japan every week, every Sunday. It was called Za Wiku, which means that's the way they pronounce the week. So yeah, people kind of knew me. I was talking Japanese somewhere once, and somebody said, "God, I know that weird accent. You must be Rido-san." So for that reason, yeah, I was quite well known. And then, can I just point out, I got the big scoop of the decade in the 1990s. The Crown Prince was getting married, and his fiance was a big secret. Everybody wanted to know. And somebody in the palace called me up and told me that it was going to be Owada Masako. And I wrote this story for the Washington Post, young woman to be new Empress of Japan. And it's not a big, it's not a big story in America. They ran it on page 848 or something, and about 2:00 in the afternoon, Tokyo time, which is midnight, 12:30 Washington time, the foreign desk calls me in my office. And I hated that phone call, because if they ever called me about that time, it was usually to say, "The New York Times has a big story in Japan today. Why don't you have it?" But this time, the editor says to me, "Hey, that story you filed about the princess, do you think it's right? And I said, yeah, I think we have it right. Why do you ask? And he said, because there are 50 Japanese reporters in the lobby of the Washington Post waiting to buy the first edition. The reason was, in my calling around to check this, they knew that the Washington Post had it. And as soon as I wrote this story, they all put out extras. They all put out extra editions. The secret was out. All the TV stations canceled all programming and only did my story. And to this day, that story of mine is called in Japanese, the Dai Scupu, the Great Scoop, the Dai Scupu. And on the 25th anniversary of their wedding, maybe 3 years ago, they flew me back to Japan to do interviews on the Dai Scupu. So I think that's why that woman wanted my autograph. I was a big cheese for a while there.
Gib, could we jump to you now on your question, if you can put it in short form?
Fantastic presentation, TR. You're just the opposite of most of us academic types that know more and more about less and less until we know everything about nothing. And you end up knowing more and more about more and more. And my question's a two-parter. Of all the writing projects you've done throughout all your career, can you name one that was kind of the most fun, and maybe name another that was where you were the most surprised?
Yeah, well, I covered a lot of sports. I covered Winter Olympics, the Asian Games. I covered a World Chess Championship that was held on the second floor of this nondescript pub in London for some reason. So I had a lot of fun doing that. One time when I was the Denver bureau of the Washington Post, it turned out there was a student at Kansas State University who had just entered the Guinness Book of World Records for having the biggest memory. He was an Indian. And I went to meet him, and the first thing he said, he recited the first 976 digits of pi to me. And then he told me the room number and the bill of a hotel when he stayed in Denver about 14 years earlier, et cetera, et cetera. And then he said, gee, I'd like to talk to you more. Can I call you? And I said, yeah, here's my card. And he said, oh, no. Don't waste a card on me. Just tell me. I'll never forget your phone number. I think it's true. I got a big prize for that story, as a matter of fact. And then the thing I think I didn't like most, I covered a lot of campaigns for prime minister in countries that Americans didn't give a damn about. So it's a lot of work, and you end up buried on page 896 of the Washington Post. One year I was covering a presidential election in Korea, and I thought it was pretty good. I was kind of interested in it. And there was this Brits are, they can be pretty cynical. And this Brit reporter says to me, why are you wasting your energy? It's three guys named Kim that nobody's ever heard of, which was true. So.
TR, I'm going to close with one question, and I'm going to key our technical experts, Lisa and Lyle, to get ready to put up a review about your book. This is what you've historically said is the greatest review that's ever been written about a book of yours. So as soon as it comes on the screen, you can talk about it. There it is.
Yeah, that's a review of one of my books. So I told you my books, they all flopped. Most of them didn't sell very well. A lot of them got good reviews, but still didn't sell very well. And then when I was living in Japan, my family, we're from Colorado. We're all skiers. We were skiing our brains out in Japan. And Japan just has fabulous ski areas, great snow and fabulous facilities, beautiful lodges. And the Winter Olympics were coming to Japan in Nagano. So I said, okay, I'll write a book, a guide to skiing in Japan. For Kodansha. I wrote it for Kodansha, their biggest publisher. So this book came out, and there are about 5 English language newspapers in Tokyo. They write for the expat community or for Japanese people who want to practice their English. So this one newspaper, #1 Shimbun it's called, the book editor, he knew he had to review this book. I mean, all the expats were going to read this guide to skiing, and he needed a skier to review it, and he needed somebody who could write English. So he assigned my book to me to review. And of course, this is totally unethical, but I did review my own book for the guy. And I used all the cliches. If you can only read one book this year, it must be Ski Japan, et cetera, et cetera. And he got the drift very nicely. I said, why read War and Peace or Moby Dick when you could be reading Ski Japan right now? And that's the headline I got. Best review I ever got.
TR, I think we've hit the appointed hour. There are still more questions that could be asked, but we promised that we wouldn't go past this point. We'd rather leave them wanting a little bit. So first of all, wow. I mean, this is wonderful. As you saw, you had a huge audience. I'll remind everybody that we're going to record this. And I find out that I don't have my video on, so I'll turn that on. Here we go. Thank you very much, but you heard my voice. So thank you. We put you through your paces on this, I know. And that's what we'll both give credit to and blame to Steve Harwood for that, who is the impresario of Tiger Talks. And what most of you don't know is that behind the scenes, Steve has a professional staff, a paid professional staff, two of whom work with us, Lisa Tashkevitz and Lyle Barrere. And that's the reason why this goes so smoothly and why pictures come up on the screen when they're supposed to and videos come up on the screen. And unless one of us on this end forgets, our own picture and voice comes up on the screen. But all of that is wonderful and necessary, but not sufficient. What we need to make it right is speakers like you, TR. And this is absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, guys. And thanks again for setting up these talks. I'm looking forward to the next ones.
Joel Primack, November 17th.
Be there.